Hey everyone, welcome to this edition of the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and big news. This episode marks one whole year of this show, of the Agronomists. So happy anniversary to us. We are officially a year old. I think this is episode 44 or 45, somewhere in there. Anyway, so clearly we took a couple of weeks off. Sorry about that. But yes, so congrats to us. Super exciting. Also, lovely to see everybody in the chat. John, thanks for being here early. Viren, you were first on whatever platform you're on, but John was well ahead of you. Already welcome everybody here. And amazingly, somehow soybeans actually got done today in Ontario, even after all that rain. And Farmer Schneck, Warren, I don't know if I'm allowed to share because I don't want to, share news that isn't mine. But Farmer Warren, so Farmer Schneck here, double crop beans came off today, 35 bushels an acre. So I didn't wait for you to say if I could or not. So I'm just going to say. Anyway, so super exciting. And it brings, of course, all sorts of great comments and questions about feeding that soil to feed that crop, of course. And that's what tonight is all about. We're going to be talking about phosphorus management. Before I bring in my guests, I do want to mention, of course, that for watching tonight, you do qualify for CEU credits if that is your jam. So head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow when this is posted on the site, and you can let us know that you watched and claim your credits. All right. So when and hats off to Pete, who is here in the comments, of course, when I said we need to talk about phosphorus, Pete said, here's who you need to talk to. Lara DeMozak, of course, said you have to talk to Jeff Schoenau. And Pete said you have to talk to Merrin Macrae. And so somehow the two of them said yes, and they are here. So welcome here, Dr. Merrin Macrae of the University of Waterloo and Dr. Jeff Schoenau at the University of Saskatchewan. Welcome here to both of you. All right.
Glad to be here.
Okay. All right, good. Now, Jeff, of course, you've been on the show before. Merrin, now you have been in our soil school before, but this is your first time on the Agronomist. So I did ask Jay for confetti for our 1 year and all that. Apparently, I'm not getting that. So we're going to work on... Oh, there we go. There, that's our full sound effects budget blown for the entire year. Okay, but anyway, there. Okay. So the comments are going nuts because, of course, I mentioned double crop beans. And yes, here in Ontario, it was a phenomenal year for it. And yes, next time, Jeff or Merrin, if you could let me know it's plaid day, I would have got in the swing of things. But apparently, I missed the memo. Okay, so... let's talk about phosphorus. Yeah, exactly. Or something. Anyway, okay, so let's talk about phosphorus, though. I do want to, there's going to be lots to talk about on double crop beans as well. It still blows my mind that that's even possible. But I want to talk, yes, about management, but obviously about losses and about estimating, of course, how much phosphorus we should be adding, how much we're going to get. Is it going to impact yield? So many big questions. So I want to start with, and this is a question, maybe we'll start with you, Jeff. Now, in Saskatchewan, of course, on the average was a very dry year. Now,
Really
so explain to me, because of course we always talked about nitrogen. We understand nitrogen quite well and how we lose nitrogen. But explain to me the ways we can lose phosphorus and whether or not dryness makes that easier or harder.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when we think about phosphorus and phosphorus losses, I think we're pretty lucky. We're dealing with a nutrient here that's really not readily lost in large amounts to water. It really isn't leached to any extent in our soils, and there's really no gaseous loss mechanisms for it either. So it tends to hang around in the soil, and that's a good thing. That enables us to maintain or even build up our phosphorus fertility with relatively good success in that strategy. But we do need to be aware that there are some transformations that take place in the soil over time. So a phosphorus reaction product that's left behind when a fertilizer pellet dissolves, and the crop can access some of that phosphorus during the season, but typically it doesn't get it all. It maybe gets 30%, 50% maximum. So what's left behind actually will over a number of years change chemical form and become less soluble. And we call that a reaction product, an aged reaction product. And so one of the things that we do think about in our cropping systems over the long term is how we might use different crops to be able to get back that residual fertilizer phosphorus that's left behind. But it's still there. And if you look at phosphorus use efficiency or recovery over a number of years, Lyndsey, actually it's not too bad, because eventually we do have a scenario where a root will get close enough to where that phosphorus is that it can actually move to it and be taken up. So we always deal with that phosphorus immobility issue.
So you've sort of changed just now. You've talked a reactionary product. I've always thought of phosphorus as sort of like the tame one at the nutrient party. Nitrogen's the partier, can be lost a whole bunch of ways. But now I've decided it's potassium, really. That's the lame duck. So this is good news in that losses, yes, can happen, but realistically, if it's in the soil at some point, crops will likely get to it. So this is good. Now, Merrin, I'll go to you. We, of course, in Ontario have had almost the opposite. We did have a dry season early on, but then, of course, this fall has been incredibly wet for many areas. And so you've done quite a bit of work on, of course, surface movement, but also subsurface movement. So walk us through that process on what we need to know about our tile runs, especially if we're in a really wet year.
Okay, so just in terms of how phosphorus is getting into tiles, is that sort of what you're asking me?
Yeah. Movement. Yeah.
Yeah, so often when we think about phosphorus losses, we've often associated it with surface runoff because, of course, that phosphorus can be held in the soil, and when the surface runoff moves over the fields, it can either transport the dissolved phosphorus, or it can erode that soil into waterways, and the phosphorus that's held on to that soil, that's holding on to that soil, off into waterways. So we always tried to do things that would get that phosphorus underground so that it could actually be held in the soil. The thing is, with tile drains, phosphorus can actually enter into tile drains through what we call preferential flow paths. And so it's kind of a fancy word, or macropores is the other word that we use. But what do we mean? We might mean wormholes, root channels, or cracks that happen in the soil. But these are all ways where I like to compare it to like a game of snakes and ladders or chutes and ladders that you might have played when you were a kid, where it can, if it just gets into one of those little pipes in the ground, it can whisk right into the tile drains and out it goes. So it kind of bypasses the soil that would normally retain that phosphorus. And then it can get directly into our waterways, which is obviously a problem.
Okay, so there's some really good questions that have come in that I do want to tackle, but I want to stop there, and just to sort of set the stage for this discussion is exactly that, why phosphorus moving off site can be or is a problem. So Merrin, maybe I'll start with you it's to continue on that thought. Why don't we want phosphorus moving through water and into our waterways?
Okay, so the very same things that we put on our fields to help our crops, because they help us with growth, can also help algae and bacteria in water grow. And so if that phosphorus escapes off of the farms and into our waterways and into our lakes, it can increase the growth of these organisms in lakes and rivers and ponds. And so in some respects, it can just be yucky green stuff. But in other respects, we can also have what we call harmful algal blooms, where you can have certain types of bacteria that grow that can cause human and pet health risks. So it's really a problem. And there's really, in our large systems, we're also getting, without getting too complicated, basically a lot can go on where we can end up getting a lot of fish kills and issues in our large lakes. And so these really can have a lot of problems in terms of economics, ecosystems, you name it. Like it's really a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Absolutely. All right. Thank you for framing that for us, because, of course, we do often focus so much on nitrogen and managing nitrogen losses, but we do very much need to think about where our phosphorus ends up. So one question, Jason Vogt out of Manitoba asked, and Jeff, I'll go to you because he's out in the West. Is there a question of the validity or anything we need to worry about with soil testing for phosphorus? So basically the reliability of the P test in a drought year. Do we need to worry about that?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, I think we've got some pretty good phosphorus assessments out there, and that includes extractions of available P and also measurement of phosphorus supply rate using PRS, resin membrane probes, is another approach. And I think particularly, after a drought year, I think one of the big issue that comes up in testing soil for available nutrients in general, not just phosphorus, is the presence of residual fertilizer bands. And that includes residual phosphorus bands. And because phosphorus doesn't move very much in the soil at the best of times, and then you get a drought year, that drought really restricts the movement of phosphorus away from that band by diffusion. And if the crop growth is poor, you're going to have a lot of that residual phosphorus and more of it left behind in that band. So that means that you're going to need to take more cores to account for that microscale variability. And it also means that another strategy is to actually sample across the seed bed so that you include in your sample not only the soil in between the bands, but also soil within that band that represents the proportion of that band that actually exists out there in the field. You don't want to bias it by simply taking all of your samples from the bands or all of your samples in between the bands. So I think the special considerations under drought come to do with working harder at your sampling strategy to account for that microscale variability.
Okay. All right, Jason, there you go. Get at her. You've got some more cores to take, I think. Now, okay, so now coming back to that discussion though of phosphorus and how it acts in the soil and reacts and lives. Scott Gillespie had a question here about because there's so many questions about nutrient cycling. Is there a question that legacy phosphorus, so that's been in there a while and finally get to it, is the success of something like a cover crop or something like that, is that accessing some of that legacy phosphorus?
I can have a go at that first, just from the standpoint of Western Canada. And legumes, I think, do a wonderful job of being able to scavenge phosphorus out of the soil and use that residual P by virtue of their ability to acidify the rhizosphere and also develop those strong arbuscular mycorrhizal relationships on their roots. And certainly many cover crops do employ a legume. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. I'll pass it over to Merrin.
Yeah, and I think there's some concern certainly in the cover crops in the West, where I know that there has been some evidence where basically when you get freeze-thaw cycles, the plants themselves can they die, they're frost killed, and then when runoff intercepts them during snowmelt, that can whisk a lot of that phosphorus, and it's in a dissolved or very bioavailable form. It can whisk that off of fields. So the question is, are all winters created equal? And the answer is no. So what really, although in the West, certainly there is evidence of these winter losses of phosphorus, we do see that you can, when you have frost kill with cover crops, we do see that it can release phosphorus, that it's picked up from the soil. But what we find is that a lot of that phosphorus just goes back into the soil, or you can manage it with the species that you grow. Like you can optimize what you plant so that you lessen that risk. And so part of it is that we just get gentler frosts here overall, but really importantly, we have a lot of snow cover that really insulates those plants. So although our temperatures can plunge, what the plants actually experience isn't as bad. So I think that cover crops here, even though yes, that potential is there, it's not as great as it is in the West. So I think they're a good bet, especially since so much of what we do lose for phosphorus is as particulate, and they really do help keep that on fields.
Right. So, and this is a thing that, there's certainly many farmers that would say, well, I don't have a lot of water movement off field. I'm not, I'm not super worried about that. But I mean, if we think back, this past winter there was very little snow cover and there was very high winds and there was soil movement. And just recently on this show, we talked about, what's in that soil that's moving. And realistically, it's very high quality soil, it's and there's a whole bunch of nutrients in there, and there would be phosphorus that's moving with that topsoil as well. So wind erosion, tillage erosion, any of that is also going to be moving that phosphorus, right? So that brings up actually to Pete's question. So Peter wants to know, Merrin, and so I think this is sort of broader scale. I'm trying to bring it up here. Rule of thumb, is there a relationship between how much we know is lost to, or moved, I guess, through erosion versus through tile run or through subsurface? In Ontario, do we know? Hang on, I'm trying to bring it up, and for some reason it doesn't want to scroll. There we go. The difference between phosphorus that moves off in soil versus phosphorus that moves in, that is water soluble. Is there a relationship we can use? So do we have a sense of what the volumes are or the scale of the problem between the two?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions that I could answer that are in Pete's question. So one is the relationship between particulate, the soil phosphorus, and the dissolved phosphorus. And so we know there's definitely a positive relationship, meaning that as your soil P increases, the dissolved P losses that you lose increase. So the more soil, the higher your soil test P and your soil P is, the greater your concentrations and losses of phosphorus are going to be. As far as whether there's a specific relationship, I do think there's a lot of variability in those relationships. So although when I said that there's a positive relationship and that yes, it increases, but it's not the only factor that might be influencing things. So then to answer the question about sort of the relative proportions, the proportion of particulate versus soluble, and soluble, like I mentioned earlier, that's really, we're after that because, of course, that's the bioavailable form, which means that's the stuff that the algae and bacteria want. So that's the one that we're really concerned about. So in terms of the proportions of these things, it really depends on where you live. And so my experience in the loamier sloping grounds in southern Ontario, so not down in the southwest where it's really flat clays, once we start to get into our, it's a little bit more undulating or sloping ground, I find that a solid 3/4 of your phosphorus losses are as particulate. And this is more so at the surface, but even in tile drainage, it's still a lot of particulate losses. Once you get down into those flat clays where it's not as easy for erosion to happen, then it's still a lot of erosion, but they're more dissolved. A higher proportion of it is as dissolved, like maybe 40% is dissolved phosphorus.
Okay. So Jeff, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and it's different here in Western Canada because here the majority of the phosphorus moves in the dissolved form, and that most of that takes place during the spring snowmelt runoff. So we don't have a whole lot of particulate material moving, although we can document some, and it does occur particularly when we have bad water erosion, but a lot of it just moves off the fields when the snow melts and percolates through that surface residue and comes in direct contact with that surface layer of soil that's just starting to thaw out. So it doesn't move down very fast. It runs across and carries the soluble P with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And of course, it's invisible, right? I mean, it's dissolved. You're not going to know it's there unless you're actually like testing for it, right? Or recognizing that's what's moving with that water, right? So now there are a couple questions here. Canadian Cowman, now they're out in BC. I think that's a really good one. I want to get into some of the application questions. So before we do that, I'm going to run our first clip. Which brings in, of course, we always talk 4 R's, right place, right time, right product, right rate, about nitrogen, but it exists for phosphorus as well. So this is a bit of a throwback video. This is Jake Monroe here with OMAFRA when this tool was rolled out a couple of years ago, and sort of looking at making the decision of how you apply that phosphorus and in relation to what your soil test phosphorus is. So Jay, if you could, let's run the clip.
Hey, one of the things we want to talk about here for our nutrient stewardship and managing phosphorus, obviously a big conversation in agriculture and in the environment in recent years, and growers looking for tools, looking for help to manage phosphorus. You folks at the OMAFRA developing a new program right now, a new tool. Tell us about it.
For sure. So what we've done, Bernard, is we've updated the phosphorus index, which some of you may have heard about, and created what we call the phosphorus loss assessment tool for Ontario. And this update basically does a few things. It keys in better on looking at losses of phosphorus from surface runoff, but also from tile. That's become a hot topic. Also looks at the impact of time of year when you're applying the product, and so I can show you a bit of that and how that plays out in a few different scenarios.
Awesome. So timing and placement, so important here, and you've sort of mapped out, timing and placement and some different rates. Take us through the chart and what we can learn from this.
Perfect. So I'll give you the background on this scenario. This is a sandy clay loam soil. This is an example where we've got an application of 100 pounds per acre of P2O5, and we're trying to decide what's the best time and placement for that fertilizer application. This is also soil that's got moderate soil erosion, so that's one of the factors to consider. So here you can see we've got two kind of scenarios. One is where we've got a soil test level that's at about a 12 part per million for Olsen, and a soil test level that's at 30 parts per million. So we'll get to this 30 in a moment, but if you take a look here on the left-hand side, at a soil test level of 12 parts per million, we're looking at that application, 100 pounds per acre, and we've got two times when we can apply it. We can either apply it after wheat comes off in August, or after soybeans in October. And so when you look here at the August application, what you see is that when that 100 pounds of P2O5 is broadcast and incorporated within a couple of days, you see that falls within the very low category. So the risk for that particular field is very low for phosphorus loss. Now, if you were to just broadcast that phosphorus and leave it on the surface, that bumps your risk rating up a little bit. It brings you into that low category. It's yellow. Really, here we're still not at a high category, and the reason for that is that the phosphorus is being applied at a time of year when we don't have a lot of water moving either through surface runoff or down through tile. Phosphorus moves when water is moving off the field, and that's the reason why we kind of get away with just leaving that phosphorus on top with that August timing. When you look at October, the situation's a little bit different. You can see we still fall in that very low category if that application is incorporated. We're talking light incorporation here. Within a couple of days, you're still in the green, that very low category. Situation is much different, however, when you've got an application. Maybe this is mid or late October. That the fertilizer spread on top, and it's just left there.
Yeah. No incorporation.
No incorporation, and it's, as you can see, we're really approaching what we consider a moderate risk category. That fertilizer is being left there, and in typically wetter soil conditions, and we might have a rainfall event that triggers some runoff, or and in addition might cause the tiles to run and move phosphorus down. Whether it's cracks in the soil or earthworm holes, that phosphorus that's not incorporated can move to tile that way.
Right. Now, how's the story change a little bit at 30 parts per million? Okay,
so remember that we're talking about a soil that has moderate erosion risk. So whenever we've got soil moving, we have phosphorus moving with it. That's been the old story. So what we're seeing here is that all the levels are elevated just slightly when we have a soil test level that's at 30 parts per million. The key message, however, is that even with the soil test level that we'd consider to be, approaching a range that's not very responsive, where we potentially are, having higher background fertility levels and a bit higher yields with a higher soil test level, but we are, if we're applying at the right time and in the right place, our phosphorus loss risk really is in that same range that we're seeing over here.
So you can go with a higher rate and handle it well and be able to sort of maximize your fertility.
So the rate is the same, but the soil test level, that's right. So the rate over time has been higher, but what it comes down to often at the end of the day is making the right decision, the right recommendation in terms of timing and placement of that product.
Awesome. Now this is a great tool. Tell us about when it's going to be available and when growers are going to be able to sort of tap into it.
So this is a very, very new revision that we've made here, but we're looking to push this out through the nutrient management software in the coming months. So 6 to 12 months should show up in NMAN software, and we're also going to be looking throughout the fall and winter to have a host farm organization post it up on their website, and we'll promote that as a way for both CCAs and producers themselves to play around with it and look at what it can do for them to help them make better decisions.
Awesome.
Back in the sunny days when we used to stand next to each other. Okay, so lots to come out of that. Now, of course, that was a throwback from a couple years ago when OMAFRA was sort of just moving out with this. Now, there's been several really good questions in there, but to me it comes down to let's talk now about application. Though there are a few, and Jason, I promise I'll get back to your soil testing question in a minute. But when we're thinking about phosphorus, we could be in a situation with a soil with already low phosphorus, perhaps quite adequate, or maybe even high. And so how does, as a farmer or as an agronomist, how do you sort of tackle each one of those as far as what's the safe rate to put on in light of course, managing losses as well? So Jeff, maybe I'll start with you in the western side. When is most of the phosphorus put on still?
Well, most of it goes on at the time of seeding, in or close to the seed row. And, I think as you say there's different scenarios. If you're dealing with a soil that is really low, deficient in phosphorus, in particular in those soils, having some phosphorus that's in the seed row or close by so that the roots of that germinating seedling can access it early on really gives that crop a jump start. We call it the pop-up effect. That start is really important, especially in cold springs when root growth is restricted, really wet. The root growth is restricted. Ability of the phosphorus is to diffuse is reduced. That's when you really see that response to that starter phosphorus, Lyndsey. I think on soils that have higher availability of phosphorus, that effect is diminished. But then we also need to be thinking about down the road, long term, that even though we have a soil that is good in phosphorus fertility to begin with, we also think about wanting to put back in what we're taking out each year so that we aren't draining the bank account down and all of a sudden end up with an empty bank account and some really expensive phosphorus fertilizer out there that we're going to have to put on no matter what. So that maintenance approach, I think, is a good standpoint to look at from the long term. And of course, some folks also want to build up phosphorus fertility when they have the cash flow to do it, and when phosphorus fertilizer prices are attractive, to go in and put a little more on than what that crop's taken out to build that level up in the soil. Now, of course, that you don't want to build it up too high because, as Merrin pointed out, then we run into issues as that availability in the phosphorus on the soil increases, which is really a reflection of soluble phosphorus in solution. As that goes up, we also increase the risk of water moving through that, transporting phosphorus across that soil and into a water body where we don't want it.
Absolutely. Okay, so Merrin, I'll go to you on so along the lines of Canadian Cowan's comment there about if you've got a soil that has a history of dairy manure or poultry litter, so you've got a background of quite a bit of phosphorus going on there. You run the risk obviously of potentially having too high a phosphorus there, but for that pop-up effect, do you still need to put down phosphorus with the seed if you've got really high background phosphorus? Like, why is it still important to have it there?
I think probably I'm going to let Jeff take that one because it's about agronomy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
that is totally fine.
On manured soils, and we did trials for a number of years. This was with liquid swine manure, with and without starter phosphorus. And, we really didn't see much of a response on the really high testing phosphorus soils. That being said, the thing about manure, and thinking here about solid cattle manure that gets broadcast on the surface and doesn't get incorporated into the soil, or only a shallow incorporation, you may not have as much phosphorus close to where those roots are going to be that you think. And I think we have seen in some cases where eliminating that starter phosphorus on a field that had cattle manure applied to it, at least in the early stages, we weren't getting as good a response as where we were with a little bit of phosphorus fertilizer used as a starter in the early days of, or the early time period of onset of manure application. I mean, eventually you can get really, really high levels if you load it up enough. And then I think your chance of seeing a response greatly diminishes.
For sure. Now, so in Ontario, though, we do still do quite a bit of broadcast phosphorus and potassium, some incorporation, sometimes quite a bit. Merrin, when we're broadcasting, even if we do incorporate, of course, we are building those levels, but relatively near the surface, of course. So how do we manage that risk? I mean, I know that with the seed for starter fert, that happens, sure. But when we're trying to broach the subject of building phosphorus levels in our soil overall, those sorts of things, is using broadcast, even broadcast and incorporated, as our main way to deliver phosphorus? Are we leaving ourselves open to larger losses?
That's a great question. I know that some of the people that we have worked with will use a subsurface placement with seed for some things, but as part of their main phosphorus application, it's a broadcast with, and that's where as part of their system, they will have a very shallow conservation till to work it in. I do think that just broadcasting it and leaving it on the surface is not optimal. I think if you think about how most of our phosphorus is being lost, when you have a lot of overland flow or surface runoff, if that phosphorus is at the surface, it's just really vulnerable to being picked up. It's going to get dissolved in that water, or the high phosphorus at the surface can be eroded and whisked off of fields, and there's very little you can do about it. So I think that certainly I do think that, sorry, I'm guessing getting a bit lost with maybe where your question was going, but I do think that broadcast does leave us vulnerable. So I think that rather than leaving it on the surface, if there's a bit of a conservation till and that's part of your system where that conservation till is part of that buildup, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then in your no-till years, if you can get it underground, that's a great idea. And that's certainly a lot safer and will minimize your losses and runoff.
Okay. And now we did have Lara. I think Lara asked a question a little while ago. Peter Johnson says, death to broadcast phosphorus fertilizer. Peter, I don't know that we can kill it entirely. I think a lot of people really like it. And we've had this conversation on many topics, on many things. If what we know is perhaps best case scenario, we know that getting that into the soil is best case. We also have to remember, if most farmers still have the equipment only to broadcast and don't have the equipment to put it all on with seed, then change is going to take a little longer, because we are talking about changing systems and changing equipment. So Pete, if you want to buy everybody new equipment, then I guess you could kill broadcast phosphorus, but until then, it's going to take a little longer, I think. Anyway, Lara had a point about rooting depth. So I want to talk about this a little bit, in that what role does rooting depth of different crops play on accessing some of this phosphorus? Jeff, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. We did some research work here about 5 years ago, where we looked at the implications of having a forage legume, which is a deep root. We had alfalfa and clover, pretty deep rooted, 2 years in a rotation with annual crops, and how that impacted phosphorus availability in the short term. And what we found is that actually, despite higher crop removal when the alfalfa and the clover were removed over those 2 years, the soil availability of phosphorus was maintained. And that we attributed to the ability of that deep-rooted alfalfa and clover to access phosphorus at depth, solubilize it by their roots, bring it up to the surface, and effectively maintain the availability of phosphorus for a period of time. Of course, that's not going to last forever, because if you keep pulling off big alfalfa and clover and not replacing it with manure or fertilizer, eventually you're going to draw down your soil phosphorus pool. But over the short term, we do see that ability of those deep-rooted crops to make some use of that phosphorus at depth, bring it up to the surface, and help maintain phosphorus fertility.
Plus, then you can feed it to my sheep. Okay. Now, John has a question here, and I mean, it's a comment, but it brings in Merrin. So I do want to talk about this idea of course, water movement through the soil profile, and as we talked about, that subsurface loss potentially through tile. So John makes a point about if you have the right amount of tile, then it should only be an extraordinary rain event that would cause runoff, right? Okay. So, but there are some sort of misunderstandings, I guess, about how tile can sometimes move water or not, those sorts of things. So, are we, how do I phrase this? It's sort of one of these, like, I imagine the water moving down and through it. Is there a way in high rainfall events? So the tile should work, it should keep surface runoff from not happening. But of course, it's going to move down through the tile and move away. What is it about a soil that's going to make it more or less prone to phosphorus loss in that scenario? Is it the texture? Is it what might make it more or less?
Okay, so as far as tile, if you have the right amount of tile preventing surface runoff, I don't know if I totally agree with that. I really think that especially around snowmelt, no matter what you do, you're going to see some level of surface runoff because the soil just gets saturated. There's just so much water going through the system at that time. So I think if we can keep it to a minimum, that's a great idea, but I don't know that we can necessarily avoid it. And it may be that you only see it a couple of days a year, but I think you're still going to see it occasionally under the right circumstances. So I just want to manage expectations that way. So then in terms of what might impact a tile, the potential for phosphorus to be lost through tile drainage, there's a whole lot of different things that are going to impact that. Certainly, as is the case with surface runoff, in the subsurface as well, the amount of soil test P that you have, or soil P, is going to affect it. So just like in the surface, the higher your soil P is, the higher your runoff losses are. It's the same with tile drainage. The higher your soil P is, the greater those losses are going to be. So that's important. In terms of clays versus, or in terms of just thinking about your textures, we do find that when you're in clay soil, well, we know that probably about 80% of our water losses at the edge of the field are lost in tile drainage, and about 20% of our water losses in Ontario, that is, are lost in surface runoff. We know that in the clays, it's probably 80% dissolved P in tile and 20% dissolved P in runoff and surface runoff. So it's about just like the amount of water. And one of the big reasons for that is because tiles can be leakier because we have those preferential flow paths like cracks and wormholes and things like that. Once you get into the loam soils, it's really different. It's really the surface runoff accounts for a lot more of the phosphorus losses, and we lose, even though we get a lot of water going through the tiles, there's not as much phosphorus that makes it out through those tiles. And part of that is because those loamy soils have the ability to buffer that phosphorus out and hold on to it. So it's part of it is having to do with the way that they drain in terms of their hydrology, and part of it is the way their chemistry works. So so texture is going to be a big part of it.
Okay, so the key there, have better ground. So there you go. That's easy solution. Just find the best ground and go move there. So sorry, I just increased the price of everybody's beautiful ground. No, in all seriousness, no. I mean, but these are the things we need to know, right? These are the things we can't change. So if you farm a piece of ground, you can add tile, but you can't change the texture of that soil. I mean, so you can manage certain things, but there's other things we just can't. So I think that's important to remember. I do want to back up a little bit because Jeff, you mentioned about in a very dry year, potentially having a concentrated band of phosphorus that was never accessed, was never used, and the importance of then making sure that your soil sampling is representative of what's actually out there for this coming year's crop. Jason wanted to know, would you have an idea of, how many cores you would want to take from the band versus outside? Would it be 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1?
Yeah, I think there's some rules of thumb there, I guess, that kind of come into that. I mean, coring is challenging. I guess if you take enough cores, you will eventually get to the point where you'll have a proportion of cores from the band in your composite sample that reflects the relative proportion or existence of those bands in that entire area of the field. But it takes it does take a lot of cores. I guess what I kind of, and some research work that we did to try to look at how you deal with that, was actually taking this slice across the seed bed and actually taking a shovel and scooping soil across so that you got maybe over a distance of say 60 centimeters, you got the area in between the seed rows as well as the seed rows where the residual fertilizer was and the bands too, all mixed together in the same sample. That's the ideal situation, but boy, do you ever end up carrying a lot of soil out of that field. That's the way that I found worked the best.
Okay, so that bottom line, I jokingly told Jason that he had a lot more work to do, but I feel like maybe I'm vindicated here. So there you go. Okay, now there is a question here that this is, I think, the crux of one of the things I wanted to tackle tonight is, of course, I mean, I think we understand nitrogen, we understand how it's lost, but we understand how much the crop uses, all those sorts of good things. But phosphorus is one of those ones. It's not all necessarily immediately and readily available. It is sort of subject to what soil type and the weather and all those sorts, and nitrogen is too, of course. But so John sort of makes this comment though, is why would we ever want to put more phosphorus on than the crop can use? If we just sample every fall and apply just the right amount, bada bing, bada boom, away we go. We never have to worry. So it's a great question because, of course, can we do that? Can we depend on the phosphorus we add? Can we depend on it to actually deliver everything the crop's going to need? Jeff, I'll maybe start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, thinking beyond just that year, the building up of your phosphorus bank account in the soil may be beneficial when the phosphorus fertilizer price is attractive. And you can ride on that down the road when it goes from $600 a ton to $1,400 or $1,500. You built up some when it was cheaper, and now I'm going to ride through this period of high prices on that residual phosphorus, that the extra that I've built up in the soil. So I think there's some incentive on when you've got the cash flow to do it to build it up a little bit, or at least put back in what you're taking out. You don't want to have it haunt you down the road that all of a sudden you're going to have to put a lot of money into phosphorus fertilizer just for sufficiency, and the prices are really high. So I consider it kind of a risk management strategy, Lyndsey.
Okay. Merrin, I want to go back to this just a little bit about the tile run, and I figured we would go through this maybe a few times because it is sort of water movement and all these, and tile just, I mean, drainage adds so much to the potential of land. But as you mentioned, obviously there is the risk of loss through tile runs. We can't change our soil texture, but what can we do to manage that risk? Is it just a matter of keeping our soil test phosphorus within a certain window and not letting it get too high, or are there other things we can do?
Yeah, I think there are other things that we can do. So certainly we talked earlier about subsurface placement. So when we know that a lot of the water that moves between the surface and tile drains happens through what we call these preferential flow paths. And so the more phosphorus we have, the higher the concentrate, sorry, what am I saying? So yeah, keeping that soil P down, or getting it down, but not too down, as Jeff was just saying. So, but getting it down is definitely your first line of defense. But another thing that's really important is if we can apply it in the subsurface, then what we can do is we can disconnect that hot phosphorus source from a lot of those preferential flow pathways. So you kind of cut it off. When you have a broadcast over the entire top of the soil, or you have a lot of phosphorus stratification at the surface, that's when those preferential flow paths have a better chance of grabbing onto some of that phosphorus and whisking it into the tile drains. And you're going to see that in clays and in loams. So definitely getting it in the subsurface is a good idea. Now, so that's sort of the ideal, because then you get the benefits of the no-till and you get the disconnection with the tile drainage. But if you have to broadcast, then certainly down in the clays where tile drains account for so much of the water and the phosphorus loss, if you have to broadcast, you're better off doing a gentle incorporation. Because then it disconnects those preferential flow paths, it reduces that phosphorus stratification, and the risk of those surface erosional losses aren't as great.
Yeah, I would
Jeff,
say I would agree.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
getting it in the ground, I think, is the key agronomically and also in environmental stewardship. I have a slide, I think, if you can just bring that up.
Sure, Jay. There we go.
Yeah. So this is some work that was done by Blake Wyeth, my MSc thesis. It is MSc thesis work back in 2014, and this was with soybean. And soybean, particularly at that time, really was just coming into Saskatchewan and interested in how the placement of phosphorus would influence the response of soybean to the phosphorus fertilization. So compared three different in-soil placements, putting it with the seed, putting it below the seed, and then broadcasting it and incorporating it, compared to just broadcasting it on the surface and an unfertilized control over there on the right-hand side in blue. And as you can see very clearly, our in-soil placement of phosphorus gave us superior yield response. In fact, the broadcast really didn't give any response over the control. And the other thing is that the in-soil placements also significantly reduced the amount of phosphorus in snowmelt runoff compared to the broadcasting. In fact, the runoff of phosphorus in the snowmelt, we had simulated snowmelt in all of our plots. The phosphorus runoff when we placed the phosphorus in the soil wasn't much different than the unfertilized control. So benefits from getting it in the ground and getting better phosphorus uptake and recovery and yield response, and also reducing the phosphorus that's exported off the field in that snowmelt runoff in the spring.
Now, forgive me, but when you say simulated winter snowmelt, I imagine students with snow cones putting them all out there on a nice day and then
Yeah.
measuring off. But do you just water them? How do you
Actually,
simulate?
it's a technique that was developed by one of my PhD students, Dr. Tom King, a few years back. We go out and we take intact slabs of soil out of each of our small plots. We bring them back in. We take them into a controlled environment room, and we put snow that we collect on the field out of them, and we let it melt, and we collect the runoff. Yep. So we try to keep the structure of the soil intact and have the surface and have that surface residue on there, because as Merrin noted, the actual surface residue itself from recent plant growth actually can contain a lot of phosphorus, soluble P, that does get released, particularly in freeze-thaw cycles. So we also simulate those freeze-thaw cycles during the melt when we do our simulation.
I am so glad I asked, Jeff, because I honestly, of course, my brain squirrels a little bit, but what you have described as the process is actually far better than I could have ever had imagined. So now this is just, see everyone, this is what happens for masters and PhDs. This is just, I love it. That's fantastic. I also that you collect the snow. So anyway, okay, so now, but you reminded me though of a question that was much earlier, and I don't even know if we'll find it, but that's okay. But that question of, plants, of course, so whether it's weed growth, whether it's volunteers, whether it's cover crops, plants that are there on the surface. Yes, Peter, squirrel. That are there on the surface. Some of them are going to hold nutrients. Some of them are going to release them faster, slower. Merrin, do we have a sense of which plants are more prone to releasing phosphorus or less?
Yeah, so we found that the more tender plants, those that tend to frost kill, so oat, oilseed radish, all tended to release more. Things like cereal rye and hairy vetch, they tended to do a lot better in terms of not losing as much phosphorus. So anything that's a little bit better with overwintering, they're just a little bit hardier. They didn't lose as much. But we also found that freeze-thaw intensity mattered. So, and I mentioned this earlier, so when you look at sort of the differences between those cover crop species, yeah, the tender ones definitely released more than these hardier ones. But if you gave them a harsh enough frost, or you terminated them, they would release a lot of the phosphorus that they're holding. But still, those tender plants were going to lose a lot more either way than the hardier crops. Huh. And then cover crops were more than the residues themselves. Like when we looked at wheat stalks and things like that, or like that didn't lose very much compared to the cover crops.
And is that just sort of a function of they're less mature and therefore faster to break down?
I think so.
Yeah, like a carbon. I'm thinking sort of carbon to nitrogen kind of ratio stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Because we did a study where we looked at the release of nitrogen and phosphorus from wild oats at different growth stages to the wheat crop they were growing in after they were terminated. And once those wild oats got beyond about 2 or 3 weeks old, very little nitrogen was released to that wheat crop growing with them because of a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. We got soluble phosphorus released in the first couple of weeks, but after that, also the release of phosphorus from the wild oats reflected in uptake by the wheat growing that had that dead residue added to it was also greatly reduced as those wild oats got older. So I think maybe the older the plants get, probably there's less potential for release.
Right. Okay. So, and Merrin, so I want to take that one step further from a management perspective. Let's say I have a cover crop that goes on after my winter wheat. It grows quite nicely. I have some tender plants, some less tender plants. We have a frost event. I've got some that have, started to break down, whatever. So that phosphorus is released. So is that now prone to, say, runoff from spring melts or from a freeze thaw? Or why am I worried about it potentially?
Yeah. Yes. So that is the concern, is that you get a frost, you get killing of these plants, and then basically that phosphorus is released. It's released out of the plant, and then the minute that runoff interacts with it, and it's dissolved phosphorus. So again, it's that bioavailable form, whisks that right off of fields and into your waterways. So that's a concern. So we know in the prairies that's a particularly big concern because number one, they get really harsh frosts, and number two, so much of their runoff is on the surface, so it's all interacting with these plants and whisking it off. What we found in Ontario, though, is that although that potential is there, we actually found that because there's that a lot of as soon as it interacts with the soil, if you have a reasonable amount of contact between the plants and the soil, then the soil actually holds on to a lot of that phosphorus that's released by the plants. So we found that even though the plants did release phosphorus following frost, that didn't translate to edge of field losses because of the buffering capacity of that soil, like the soil was able to hold on to it.
Very cool. Now, Jeff, I'll go back to you because I have a question. You mentioned you did this work with wild oats. Why wild oats? Because you had them?
Because,
why?
when it comes to weed control, you're always interested in reducing the competition of the weed for everything that it competes for. And it competes for space, it competes for water, it competes for sunlight, it competes for nutrients. So I think what we wanted to look at is the benefits of early weed control in preventing that competition to begin with, but also how does the timing of weed control affect the ability of that crop to access the nutrients that were tied up in those weeds. So yeah, that's why we looked at it, just to see what you actually get back at different timings of weed control as far as availability of nutrients.
Okay. So, and that actually has come up a couple times, and I don't know if anyone will hop here in the comments, but anyone who's been watching this show throughout this season and this incredible dry year, there's been a lot of discussion about, do you let the rain that did eventually come in parts of Manitoba, there was a flush of weeds in the fall. Do you let them grow? Do you not? And so this is where that starts to play in of what those plants do take up and then what they cycle and when it will be available, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a huge amount of, in many cases, volunteer second growth on canola, to the point that in some cases, in some fields, it was starting to flower. And we've only got a killing frost here maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. So you do have a lot of nutrient tied up in that volunteer growth or second growth. It's kind of like a cover crop. In a sense, it's good from a nitrogen standpoint. Perhaps it's not going to get lost, that residual nutrient, over the winter. But I think it don't expect it all to come out right away in the available form in the spring.
Right. Yeah. And also, I believe we've been calling that canola zombie canola. this year. And I had Farmer Jim Hale from Lancaster, Saskatchewan sent me pictures this week of his canola that it was, ripe and also had new growth that was flowering. So
Yeah. Very
very
common.
bizarre. Yeah, very strange. Okay, so Ken has a really good question, sort of in the same vein. How much phosphorus is going to be released in a crop, canola, he says, that was 90% hailed out? Will it be released in the next year? Will it all be on the soil surface? Do you incorporate the residue? There's a lot of questions there. Let's unpack this one a little bit.
Yeah, so if it was hailed out early enough and young enough, I recall work that we did. This is back in the 90s. That about 50% of the phosphorus in the stubble in the plant was in a soluble form that could actually be removed by water without any kind of microbial decomposition. So and that happens in the middle of the season, and then you get microbial decomposition taking place in some organic. There a lot of that organic. I think you'll get a lot of that phosphorus back out by the end of the season, and going into the next year following, you're going to get it back. Will it all be on the soil surface? Yeah, a fair bit of it probably is going to be on the surface. I don't think I would worry about actually incorporating the residue, and if you're in a no-till system, going in and actually disturbing and destroying that whole kind of litter or thatch layer on the surface just for the sake of trying to get some more phosphorus down below it. But I think even if it's on the surface, it will make some contribution. It'll make its way down eventually. Eventually, it'll get used by the roots. It's kind of like putting manure on the surface, broadcasting it. It's not ideal in terms of positional availability, and it is more susceptible to movement in water. But if you can get it to interact a little more with the soil, like Merrin says, it's gonna stick there better. But it's still not going to be where those roots are ideally. But over time, with some mixing that occurs, yeah, some roots will get close to it.
Now, Ken's follow-up was, will that extra phosphorus show up in a soil test?
Yeah, I would think it would. It would be inorganic P that would show up in any kind of an assessment, like an extraction or a measurement of a supply rate. Yeah, I think you should see it.
Okay. Because of course, and this will be my moment here, and Merrin and Jeff, maybe you can back me up on this, but I've decided that this is my it's my New Year's resolution, is to increase the amount of fields that get soil tested, because apparently we just aren't doing that great on the amount of fields we soil test. And so let's maybe encourage that, because it just seems every time we have these conversations, so much of it comes back to that soil test, right? There's so many things that soil test tells us, but if we're not taking them or on a regular basis or not sampling correctly, we don't know what we have. So
I think we're getting better.
Yeah?
I do think we're getting better. I think there's more fields getting tested, and a real driver of it this year is a few things here in the prairies is, again, that residual nutrient left behind from the drought. How much is there? And then in the face of some increasing fertilizer prices and issues even surrounding availability, man, you really got to know what's there. And so my thoughts, soil testing is more important this year than I think it ever has been. Certainly here on the prairies, probably everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Merrin, you do some really cool research. I highly recommend everybody go check it out. Like, in an average year, how many soil samples do you think your team would end up taking when you're working on some of this stuff?
A lot. I don't even know. I don't even know.
Thousands, right?
Yeah, and the water samples are even more, though, right? Like, it's the runoff and the tile drain samples, but thousands and thousands and thousands, and it is. Yeah. There's a lot of samples that get collected in a given year, and so there's I don't even know. I don't want to give you an. I don't want to know.
I was going to say, maybe you don't want to know. And also, Peter would like to point out that I only played one clip. And that this is now a trend, because apparently I try to do 3 and only ever get to 1. But I always pick 3, Pete. Everyone should know that when I prepare for the show, I always choose 3 clips and sometimes some extra stuff. Sometimes there's a tweet in there that I grab. We get talking and I forget about them. And then if you look at the time, everyone, it is 9, which because of the time change for those of us outside of Saskatchewan, Jeff, it is much later than it actually is. And I am exhausted. So there you go. But Jeff, of course, lives in the land of no changing clocks.
Oh yeah, we can go on for another hour.
Yeah, I did not have that much coffee. I'll tell you right now. Anyway, Peter, he says that I pick 3 videos and then I make the guests watch them and then I don't use them. You know what? We're just well prepared. That's it. Okay. All right. It is 9 o'clock. We are through our hour, which I promised you, Merrin, it goes quickly. So I hope you actually think that it did. This was a lot of fun. I'm sure we could, we joke about doing another hour, but there have been so many great questions. I really appreciate it. Everyone in the comments, there's plenty we didn't get to, so we'll just add those to the next time we do this discussion. And thank you, Jeff Schoenau, to Merrin Macrae. Thank you both for being my guests and sharing your time and your knowledge. I really do appreciate it. And of course, to everyone else watching, be sure to go get your CEU credits. But until next time, cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.